Constitution. And now I'll ask for the report of our treasurer, Nat Brayton.
Thank you, Stuart. And thank you to all those corporators and other members and other friends for zooming in to our annual meeting today. Can everyone hear me? Did I successfully unmute myself?
You're good.
Okay. Through early March, the museum was on track to finish fiscal 2020 in June with a small surplus from operations as usual. Annual appeal was running about 5,000 ahead of its year-ago total, and other net fund sources were running on plan. Then came COVID and its lockdown. Annual appeal solicitation was put on hold in March and April. Our usual June fundraising event had to be canceled. The end result was that we finished 2020 with a deficit from operations of $15,000. That was our first deficit from normal operations since fiscal 09, which encompassed the entire 08-09 financial crisis, which was another anomalous event. That deficit represents a negative shift of about 68,000 from last year's bumper crop surplus of 53,005. This entire shift can be accounted for by the declines in just two revenue lines. The larger decline, minus 41,000, was in the catch-all other gifts category. We always expected a decline there because 2019 benefited from a significant trust termination gift. But we were not expecting pre-COVID that the net from fundraising events would be down by 25,000. Most of that decline is attributable to the cancellation of the June fundraising party. Annual appeal solicitation resumed in late May, and thanks to heroic efforts by Jessica, Dawn, and AA Chair Sam Gray, the 2020 appeal was down from last year by only 3%, just about $4,000. A pretty good result under the circumstances and a testament to the loyalty of our donors in emergency times. Total gross expenses, as you see on the table there, let's see, on my screen, it's a little bit below the bottom. Can that be scrolled up? Anybody, total operating expenses? Can we scroll that up by?
That is the whole, that's the whole screen that they're seeing.
Oh, okay. So if you can see it, you'll see the total gross operating expenses were down 7%, which sounds pretty good, until you see that most of that decline was due to the fundraising events the cost of the fundraising events that we didn't hold this year. General administrative expenses, other not fundraising related expenses, were collectively up, though only by about 4,000 from 2019. That's about plus 1%. By itself, that was not any problem. The problems were about the missing revenue that we usually get in May and June. So that's the operations side, and I will turn now to the non-operating side, the capital side, for which we have a different small table here. Our largest single capital asset by market value and by number on the books is actually not the house and the property, but rather our long-term investment fund. It delivered a net investment return of plus 1.8% for fiscal 2020, despite the COVID events starting in March. The $80,000 value decline that you see here from last year to this, $2,060,000 down to $1,980,000, was due entirely to withdrawals, which were somewhat larger than the net dollar increase delivered by the investments only. The withdrawals consisted of the year's operating draw of $78,000 plus a one-time extra $40,000 draw in September 2019. As I reported at the meeting a year ago, that draw was voted by the board to replenish operating cash after the heavy 160,000 plus director transition expenses of 2018. So we are finally cycling past the impact of that year. The fund did give us a little scare in March. It was down 17% for that quarter, but it recovered almost all of that decline during the last quarter, our fourth quarter, which is the calendar second quarter, thanks to the miraculous recovery of the US stock market in calendar Q2. Because of that recovery, the operating draw allowed by our spending formula for 2021 is actually up very slightly, a few $100 over 2020. What happens in 2021 remains to be seen, of course. The last week has been a little unpleasant. On the physical plant side, 2020 was a relatively quiet year with no capital scale projects undertaken. We did spend $2,500 rehabbing the rental apartment after our longtime tenant vacated, but the accounting rules require all those outlays to be expensed in full this year. So they all showed up under operating expenses. In times of economic disruption and uncertainty, the liquidity position on an institution's balance sheet is a critical measure of its near-term stability or even viability. Our 2020 year-end operating cash position was actually up by 9,000 over 2019 to about 95,000, despite the cash drain of the 15,000 operating deficit. Net working capital was up also. And we took on no debt again during this past year, leaving us debt-free as we have been for decades. And debt-free is a real good position to be in times of economic disruption. None of this is to declare victory, financial victory over the COVID economy. Our 2021 remains highly uncertain because the course of COVID itself remains uncertain. We will continue to need the help and financial support of all of you who brought us through 2020. And for that, I thank you sincerely. And that ends my report. Stu?
Thank you, Nat. Thank you for keeping us on an even keel through some rough weather. And now I'll ask for a report from Sam Gray, who's the chairman of the annual appeal. Sam?
Good afternoon, and thank you for attending the annual meeting of the Rotch House. As chairman of the annual appeal, I must acknowledge that we are living in an unfamiliar time while negotiating the COVID-19 pandemic. It has been a difficult time for institutions that rely on membership and donor support, and the RJD was no exception. While we fell just short of our goal for the 2019-2020 annual appeal, I am confident that the 2021 annual appeal, with your help and support, will be more successful. Many of the institutions in New Bedford contend for funding from the same pool of donors. However, with fresh and creative ideas for experiencing the RJD, we will be more successful in our challenge to reach our annual appeal goal. With all of this in mind, we have agreed to set a goal of $119,000 for the 2020-2021 annual. This amount is attainable, but not without your loyal support. Today, as in the past, we feel it is important to set realistic goals for the annual appeal, and for the annual appeal, this is no exception. The annual appeal is somewhat of an indication of support from the surrounding community, which actually influences seeking grants and other public funding for the museum. What that means is your contribution to the RJD is all the more important. And at this time, we are off to a great start, and thank you. We are also planning on communicating with all of you more often, We feel it's important to keep you all informed about programming and events at the house. One most important part of our solicitation of funds from the membership is having the Board of Trustees lead the way with 100% participation. I am pleased to let you all know that this is the case. The board cannot stand alone. Without the support of all of you, the RJD would be in a difficult position and unable to offer the experiences we have come to enjoy. Hopefully, when we are allowed to congregate in larger groups, our new outside event planner, Isabel, along with our outstanding house event expert, Jessica, will receive all of the help they need to create new and exciting ways to experience the RJD. In closing, as I am fond of saying, please reach out to friends, extended family, and business associates to come visit the Roach House, walk among the roses, and stop for a minute under the pergola. The gardens have been beautifully maintained by our resident green thumb, Rick, and offer a peaceful time for thought and reflection. The RJD, as a National Historic Landmark, occupies a very important place in our nation's history, as well as, of course, New Bedford. Again, thank you all for coming and supporting the RJD. We hope to see many of you in the coming year. Thank you.
And thank you, Sam. The annual appeal is our most important source of income, and I hope everyone will join me in increasing their contribution this year. We really appreciate your support. The next item on the agenda is to consider revisions to the bylaws. Thanks to the governance committee members of Hal Allen, Nat Brayton, Jack Dresser, Craig Espinola, Diana Henry, and especially to attorney Mark Gold, who donated his legal services. The proposed revisions were sent to every corporator with proposed changes marked in red. The board always had 3 terms of trustees and 1 year for officers, but we had no limits on renewal of terms. The new bylaws follow best practice and impose a limit of 3 3-year terms on all trustees, officers included. We see this change as a commitment to diversity and to getting fresh perspectives on the board. Along with other minor editorial changes, the revisions also state that all trustees shall be considered corporate members during their tenure, so that, like corporators, current trustees have the same power over the corporation. It also provides more detail on how corporators may resign or be removed from their position. May I have a motion to move forward the changes to the bylaws with a single ballot? Sam, you're muted.
About that, yes, so moved.
So moved. Do we have a second?
Second.
I ask the RJD corporators present at this meeting to vote by Zoom poll on the screen. Let's see. All right, so the motion is approved. And we will move to the next, let's see, close that out. So the second motion, may I have a motion to accept all the red line changes to the bylaws as noted in your packets?
So moved.
Do we have a second?
Second.
I ask the RJD corporators present at this meeting to vote by Zoom poll on the screen. So the motion is approved. Okay, thank you very much. And now we turn to Ruth Jolliffe with the report of the nominating committee.
With thanks to the nominating committee members, Hal Allen, Brenda Dias, and myself, Ruth Jolliffe, I respectfully submit the following report. To be elected new corporator for life, Jerry Gray. To be elected as trustees to a first term of 3 years, Stephen Anderson, Nathaniel Brayton, Anne Marie Lopes, Ruth Oliver Jolliffe, and Stuart Young. Trustees to be elected for a second term of 3 years, Timothy Haydock, Kenneth Lauderdale, and Natalie Mello. And trustees to be elected as officers for a term of 1 year, Clerk Jack Dresser, Treasurer Nathaniel Brayton, Vice President Natalie Mello, and President Stuart Young.
Thank you, Ruth, Hal, and Brenda. May I have a motion for the clerk to cast one ballot for the slate as nominated?
So
So
moved.
moved.
We have a second?
Second.
I ask the RJD corporators present at this meeting to vote by Zoom poll on the screen. Okay, so the motion is approved. Thank you. So now we'll turn to Dawn Salerno, our Executive Director, with a report on the state of affairs of RJD. Dawn?
Thank you, Stuart. And thank you all who were tuned in here today, especially for adapting to our new format. We hope to be back to our possibly our in-person meeting so that we can see you next year. Thank you to the RJD board. I'm truly appreciative of the support that the staff gets from this board. Those of you working for other nonprofits know what a demanding year this has become for both boards and staffs. In the period between our shutdown on March 13th and reopening on July 9th, our team studiously prepared for what would be the new normal of risk prevention. Vigilant cleaning, mask wearing, distancing, digital content, communication strategies for all this new practice, and virtual meetings like this one. We found that the RJD was well poised for some of the new restraints. After all, our historic houses, our spaces are best viewed when smaller groups visit, and you're not supposed to touch things in the museum anyway. Other aspects of the new normal continue to present challenges, like the demand for online programming and content. Our internet infrastructure is not strong enough to support streaming, for example, and under no staff job description was the assignment to generate daily digital content. We're currently working on the former, and we have already changed the latter. The staff has truly risen to the challenges presented, working harder and smarter, learning new things and trying new things. I want to mention that the New Bedford nonprofit community was a huge support. Amanda and Ashley are both on this call, representatives from the Whaling Museum and the Art Museum. It was invaluable to have a sounding board and just to be able to ask, how are you folks dealing with this? Where are you finding toilet paper? No kidding, these questions were asked. We are so much in the now of this pandemic that it's hard to remember what normal was. And in some cases we've learned we do not want to return to that normal. The exercise of putting together this presentation about the year reminded us that we did have some fabulous events and programs for about 8 months before the shutdown. The year's changing exhibition schedule ensured that there would be something new for you returning visitors. The exhibition of wedding dress, photos, and ephemera included several loans from all 3 of our namesake families. This is to have and to hold family weddings remembered, on view about this time last year. Shaking the Foundation's movements towards equity for women, this exhibition examines some of New Bedford's connections to the suffrage movement in a year marking the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. Following the recommendation of our Collections Assessment Program report, which is an IMLS-funded program, the museum began making improvements to its registration and collections care processes, as well as modifying spaces in the building to mitigate risk of damage. The collection of Jones family letters dating 1820 to 1880 was a gift recently, including from Sarah Forbes, and it included this miniature here that you see, and some other ephemera. The other image that you see on the right, this is a bedspread of Chinese silk, hand embroidery, belonged to Sarah Roach-Arnold, who was the daughter of William Roach Jr., who is our namesake. And this was a gift of Mary Elliott Jackson. So let's travel back in time, shall we? To the before time, when programs were not virtual, but actual. Programming at our historic site, whether in person or virtual now, aims to appeal to broad audiences, connecting people through storytelling, providing aesthetic respite, and deepening their understanding of humanity. The museum continued to run family-friendly free days, such as open house in collaboration with the James Arnold Mansion, the second annual Pumpkin Parade, which will be running again this year and as our one of our in-person events in October, and Nuptials and Nosh, which I love the title of. This was an event to introduce vendors to the museum as a rental facility, and couples were invited as well. For AHA this year, we contributed 7 months of free AHA night programming. And when they went virtual, the museum followed in kind. Participants could enjoy concerts, lectures, and children's activities at no charge. And I will mention that the newest program this past year of the RJD is called History Happy Hour, and we have one coming up. This has gone virtual for the fall and probably winter. So there's one coming up next Tuesday, 5:30 p.m. We can't serve you the beer, but you can buy your beer and do a tasting at home with our bartender, Nick Serpa. And then that's going to be followed by a talk with by Mark Prochnick, who is from the Whaling Museum, speaking of collaborations. Museum is a partner to area schools as well, offering field trips and teacher professional development. Teachers that you'll see on the screen from Nativity Preparatory School in New Bedford spent a summer learning, or summer day, sorry, a summer day learning museum teaching strategies with me. And this is one of my favorite jobs as a director. Growing Ideas, Cultivating Connections enrolled over 400 4th and 5th grade students in the fall of 2019. That's the photo you see on the top. This science-based program fulfills part of the requirements in the Massachusetts Science Curriculum Frameworks for 5th grade. We have heard from New Bedford Public Schools just, I think it was yesterday, that they're so appreciative of this kind of programming that we and others in the city provide, but it is just not possible for them to do field trips this year. It is not possible for them to have outside visitors come to the school or even accept kind of teaching kits because they would have to worry about cleaning those. They are welcoming virtual programs, and that is why we are working to adapt some of our in-person programs to that virtual format. In October 18th specifically of 2019, a mystery unraveled across the parlors, dining room, and bedrooms of our 1834 mansion. And this was the Mystery at the Mansion, the debut of our Whodunit event. We do hope you'll join us for this year's virtual version of that. We are putting together a series of kind of creepy vignettes, all in a safe format of online Facebook Live. The annual holiday decorations were enjoyed by guests to our new tea series. The series concluded with a children's tea, and plushy friends and dolls were invited, and boy, did the kids take us up on that offer. We are also planning on decorating the house for this season, so that's why I was just now in August talking about Christmas. If you are an RJD member, thank you. We like to thank you with in-person events or member events. So we did run one in person on February 2nd this year, and we had our second one just recently on Zoom. So we're willing to do those for you, and we will continue with those. Thank you to those of you who have participated in all of these programs and events that we held. You are why we do what we do. So unfortunately, June 2020's garden party event, which some of you have attended probably every year, longer than I've been attending, it was on track to be wonderful, and you see some preliminary designs of our theme. So consider that a teaser for a future garden party when we can have you back. So in preservation efforts this past year, I'm showing you three of our efforts. The Garden Club of Buzzards Bay has had a very close relationship with the museum since the museum's inception. In 1988, they planted the Civic Garden to beautify the property of what was a fledgling museum then. Since the issuance of the Olmsted Center's Cultural Landscape Report, which was a 2012 report given to us, the club has supported the RJD in its efforts to restore the gardens to the Jones era of 1880. The Civic Garden provided color and interest for many years, but the cultural report specifically recommended its removal. And with the support of the club's executive committee and funding, the area was restored to grass by Jim Perry Landscaping this past October 2019. So thank you, Jim Perry, also a corporator here for the RJD. The late 19th century pergola, a landscape focal point and backdrop to so many special events, was in need of some minor repairs and a fresh coat of weatherproofing paint. So our very own Rick Finneran completed that work in August of 2019. Two other smaller pergolas were painted at the same time. And as has been mentioned, with the departure of long-term tenant Colin Williams, I think he was here at the start of the museum, came the need to refurbish the apartment on the second floor of the Jones era coach house. So we did some minor electrical work, carpentry, floor refinishing and painting to set it up for the next tenant. July began a window restoration, and I hope you'll all look at your emails to come. Our e-news is going to feature some of that window restoration with John Alman. It's a nice collaboration between Whale and ourselves. Official recognition of the RJD's contribution to the cultural district has come. The Mass Cultural Council approved an expanded Seaport Cultural District for another 5 years to now include the Rotch-Jones-Duff House and Garden Museum and the entire Abolition Row Historic District. Massachusetts State Senate and House Representatives separately cited, quote, the Seaport Cultural District's work in elevating New Bedford by creating and promoting rich cultural experiences that improve our quality of life, foster growth and economic development, and celebrate what makes us unique. While the pandemic has negatively impacted in-person attendance, it has done the opposite for virtual interactions. The demand for online engagement, combined with the social media savvy of membership and events coordinator Jessica Broder, has driven major increases in our online audiences, as you can see from this slide. Partnerships for discounted and free ticketing help to make culture accessible to a wider range of audiences, and so visitors to the New Bedford Whaling Museum could purchase a joint ticket to the RJD at a discounted price. This is a long-standing partnership we have with them. The RJD is also a Blue Star Museum, offering free admission to the nation's active duty military personnel and their families between Memorial and Labor Days. And the museum expanded its free admission program through the Mass Cultural Council and now offers free admissions to both EBT and Connector Care card holders. This past year, as we do each year, the staff worked with volunteers, specifically a core of 34 volunteers. There they are on screen, some of them, not all 34, obviously. They've helped us with administrative functions, fundraising, events, and teaching. The occasional special project and special volunteer will also present itself, and that's when no one but a volunteer will do to transcribe your historic document, which is in cursive that no one can read otherwise. So many thanks to volunteers. Additional thanks, not enough thanks can be said to the staff of the RJD this year. As I said before, they really kind of upped their game since COVID especially. So I want to acknowledge the great group of people I work with: Blair Walker, Rick Finneran, Jessica Broder, and our newest staff member, Isabel D'Souza. We were also fortunate to have an intern, Elizabeth Beasley, last summer. She worked in the curatorial department and was a great help, plus just great company. It's just so nice to have another person in the room. Betsy Pino and our two event assistants, Cheryl Gagney and Taylor Tierney, also are just they give vital support to finance and event rentals in respective order. So thank you to them. In closing, I want to thank those of you who've tuned in here, my colleagues, RJD members and donors, and the volunteers. The camaraderie and support you've shown me and the museum gives me hope, and I look forward to whatever may come this year, since I know I will have you for company. Thank you.
And thank you, Dawn. It's clear that in spite of COVID-19, excellence, resilience, and some fun along the way have made for a successful year. And now I'm going to turn back to you for recognition of volunteers and our outgoing board member, Jerry Gray, who played a very important part in this success.
Thank you, Stuart. Well, great volunteers come in all forms and can be measured in many ways. The RJD likes to recognize volunteers for their dedication, reliability, enthusiasm, hours and years worked over time, and sometimes years, many, many, many years, personality, passion, and above all, the positive effect they have on RJD's operations, programs, and people. So years ago, Agnes Armstrong organized, she was a volunteer who organized volunteers to help the RJD with events and tours. The group that resulted was dedicated and driven to excellence. They were kind of self-managed and kept the place going. So this 2020 award really honors her spirit. We are honoring 4 people, and you see 3 slides only. I apologize for that because apparently the 4th volunteer, he's just so busy, I've never caught a photo of him. So I'm going to start with the woman on the left there. If you don't know her, you haven't been to the RJD ever, most likely. Joan Bullard is a docent and events volunteer. She's taught in our Growing Ideas, Cultivating Connections, or apiary program, which was mentioned earlier, since its beginning, 1998. And also she's taught in our history program for school children since the early 2000s, as far as we can tell. Maybe she knows the specific year. When the volunteers self-organized into this group called the Friends, she served as president and was the organizer and arranger for all the instructional speakers that the Friends brought in for themselves. She and her husband Peter have supported the RJD both financially and with many donations to the collections. We love Joan, we miss her, and wish she could visit us soon. Brenda Dias says about Joan, her service as docent is outstanding and a faithful example to us all. I know you're all clapping. I know, I can hear you. Vivian is in the middle there. She's missing her counterpart, Dave. So Vivian and Dave Medeiros are really literally a team in every sense of the word. When we call the Medeiros household for help on a special event like the June fundraiser, we don't get just one, but the team of husband and wife to volunteer. By the way, can you dress in black, carry heavy trays, be on your feet for 4 hours? And Dave and Vivian, they say yes. They have volunteered for many special events over the years. According to Jessica Broder, quote, "Whenever I have Vivian and Dave by my side at an event, I know everything is going to run smoothly. I just love how calm, cool, and collected they are all the time and how they always ensure the guests are enjoying themselves. I can't tell you how many times a crisis arose at an event. I don't even want to hear what that crisis was, just don't tell me. And Vivian and Dave swooped in, calmed me down, and helped come up with a solution. They truly are a joy to work with, and I'm so grateful to them. So thank you, Vivian and Dave. And I hear that applause again. I hear it.
Yeah,
And there we go. And on the right of your screen, you'll see Joe Tardif. I swear that little smile, that's how I would picture him all the time. He's always got that great little smile. Joe has shared his expertise and experiences with the New Bedford students as well as RJD docents for the past 18 years by volunteering in RJD's, you've heard it again, Growing Ideas, Cultivating Connections, our apiary program teaching about bees. He has shared his enthusiasm as well. As I described it, Joe had the precarious job of explaining this life cycle of the bee, including reproduction, to 4th graders, I think, actually 4th graders. To quote staff Blair Walker, listening to him, we have learned something new every time. So please, at home, You may clap, you may raise a glass to those outstanding volunteers of the year. We're so lucky to have you and your contributions. Thank you. Yes, clap. So I will turn the microphone, the virtual microphone, over to Ruth Jolliffe next, and she is going to speak to you about our next outstanding volunteer.
What is the definition of an exemplary board member? The answer is Jerry Gray. Jerry joined the RJD board in 2007, going on to become vice president. Her quiet leadership and wise counsel on many committees was always welcome. She was supportive of the staff as well as other board members. She was always available to lend a hand, whether with ideas or events, corralling guests, or with her husband Sam at event setup and breakdown, no matter what the day. Our former director put it, Jerry arrived with all the qualities that make an ideal addition to a board: warmth, wisdom, commitment, and the interpersonal skills that foster good communication and positive outcomes. A board member said, one of Jerry's main attributes has been her never-ending support for the RJD in always spreading the word of what the history of the museum and garden means to New Bedford and the surrounding areas. I also can sing Jerry's praises, and for many years that I've known her, I was also lucky enough to serve with her on another board. We are all so fortunate to have served with Jerry. Her gracious, dedicated, and generous presence on the board will be sorely missed. She is key to the success of any institution. Thank you, Jerry. You are always welcome here. With love.
Hey. Thank you, Ruth. This concludes the business portion of our annual meeting, and I declare the meeting adjourned. And now for the fun part, so don't sign off. It's my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker, Carrie Taylor. Carrie came to Providence's Lippitt House Museum to be its first director in 2013. Previously, Carrie was collections manager at Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home outside of Charlottesville, Virginia. Before moving to Virginia, she worked in the curatorial department at the Atlanta History Center. She was elected to Phi Beta Kappa and graduated cum laude from the University of Georgia with a bachelor's degree in history. She then earned a master's degree in public history with a museum studies concentration from the University of South Carolina, where she held a graduate assistantship at the McKissick Museum in Columbia. She's an active member of several professional organizations, including the American Association for State and Local History, the New England Museum Association, and the Victorian Society in America. She serves on the board of the Friends of the Brown University Library and is a graduate of the Seminar for Historical Administration. Please welcome Carrie Taylor.
Hello, thank you so much for allowing me to speak to you all today. Let's see if I can enable my screen sharing for my presentation. Let's try this again. Yes, I think we have it now. Right? All right, great. Everyone can, Don, you can see. Great. So thank you so much for having me this evening. When Don and I had talked initially, I think it was in February, it was a very different world that we were imagining that I would be talking with you all about today. So I'm, even from a distance, I am in the virtual Lippitt House right here, even though no secrets, don't tell anyone, I'm actually in my own dining room at home, but I'm very happy to talk with you tonight. And so what I thought we could do a little bit this evening is, for tonight's meeting, let's talk about what's kind of next for historic house museums. One of my favorite things to do is talk with other people who enjoy old houses and museums as much as I do. But this is a very different time that we are living in right now, not only because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also we are living in the Black Lives Matter era. And when our world is changing all around us, what should house museums do to be relevant to our community? This evening, I'm going to pose some questions, some big ideas for us to consider. Sometimes I'll be drawing on my own personal professional experience, not as the definitive or the only answer to these big questions and these big issues, but hopefully as an example of that might spark other thoughts and discussions that you as supporters of the Rotch-Jones-Duff House may be able to have. And at the end, I'll leave time for some questions. So for tonight's talk, I was inspired by an address given by Governor Henry Lippitt, made to the Rhode Island General Assembly in 1876. And he's instructing the state legislators at the beginning of this section of the annual session to perfect laws, to enact just ones, and to labor for the common good. These are among the duties now imposed upon you. So tonight, let's think about what duties museums have to our community. How can we, as museum enthusiasts and volunteers and supporters, quote, labor for the common good, especially in this time of many uncertainties and life disruptions? So like I said, we're in a very different time than we were before. So how can museums evolve to stay relevant? And there are some big things that I'd like to talk with you this evening. One is, what are the types of discussions we should be having with our visitors? And in this time of social distancing and capacity limits, how can we have these conversations both in person and virtually? How can we improve the diversity of the perspectives and experiences that museums choose deliberately to amplify, that try to try to convey the complexity of American history. American history is not a straight line towards progress. There's lots of dips and turns. And how do we convey that general kind of journey with our visitors? And then how do we make these stories inviting? How do we make it fun, inclusive, and relevant to all our neighbors, not just the people who know us and like us already, but the ones that don't know us yet? And is just like we're dealing with tonight, how we can do these in extremely small groups or even remotely through social distancing can make a lot of these conversations, difficult, or let's just say challenging. Maybe difficult isn't the right word, but more challenging. And then I was glad I was able to listen to the business portion of your meeting. There is a real economic crisis that arts and cultural organizations are dealing with. In July, the American Alliance of Museums predicted that 1 out of every 3 museums may shutter forever as funding sources and financial reserves run dry. And just for a little bit of context, in 2014, it was estimated there were a little over 35,000 museums in the United States. That would mean a loss of about 11,000 museums just directly related to the economic hardships imposed and the restrictions of COVID-19. So I think we can use this time when we're not really as cultural institutions, as museums that usually host lots of programs and have lots of tours. I think we can use this disruption as an opportunity to refocus our efforts and maybe come out with a new purpose. Use this as a time to kind of like reconvene and refocus our efforts. And I think as Dawn mentioned, not come out of this the way that we went into it. I think if we are strategic. I think that we can come out as a field as stronger and really kind of magnify the positive effects that in-house museums can have on their local communities. It's going to be challenging, but I think the big idea is if we don't try, change will never happen. And so together, I like us to think about the potential of museums as agents of change, not just ones that are preserving the past, but actually moving us as a people forward. And think about what we can do collectively in that idea of to labor for the common good. What I'm going to talk about are some of the ideas I've been thinking about, not only since March, but really throughout my career. And I really hope that we can make it so more people can enjoy these wonderful historic resources that we all spend so much of our resources on preserving, not just financial, but also the human resources that go into keeping these places together. So for this next part, I think Jessica is going to help me out and put up a poll that I'd like to see everyone kind of vote on. And let's see if we get the question up. And the question is, why do you support the Rotch-Jones-Duff House? It's a multiple choice. You can put in multiple answers. There's no right or wrong answer, but if you want to have a look at that, I'd like just to see what kind of sparked your interest in supporting this great agency here in New Bedford. I see it's kind of like watching the lotto. I see the numbers coming in, categories going up, categories going down. It's very exciting. Let's see. All right. It's interesting to see that as I'm looking at it right now, it looks like things are pretty evenly divided. A lot of people are supporting the institution, the museum, because they want to support in general, the New Bedford arts and cultural scene. It also looks like another big contender was enjoying the garden and landscape. And that's really, I'm sure all the staff are very happy to hear that for all the work that I know that y'all have done in the last few years, especially with the rose garden. So, but it's not one answer there. There's multiple answers. So thank you all for just kind of giving me a little, let's see, should we share it right there? Great. Great. You can see what all the multiple right answers are. Great, thank you so much. And so for the next part, I'd like to have you think back on what was it, do you remember your first house museum or historic site visit? And what, and maybe kind of think a little bit about what made you, what you remember about that. And I was hope that people can maybe use the chat feature and we can see what some of the answers are here for why people, let's see. I don't think it can be chat. Should it be a question and answer then, I think?
So that you're welcome to use the Q&A. We can look at the Q&A if you don't. Yeah.
So I'd just like to see what was your first historic house museum or historic site experience? Was it a field trip? Was it a trip with your family? Was it part of a national pilgrimage going to some of the big sites in American history?
If you're having trouble using Q&A, just put it in the chat. I'll look in both places for it.
Okay. All right. Oh, do we have someone? It'll take a little bit for people to type out their answers, but I think we'll see that there's probably as many people who are participating in our meeting this evening. There's probably as many answers. So let's see some of that we have. Oh, great. School field trips, going with family members. Oh, and some of the kind of the icons I see, Fort Ticonderoga and Gettysburg, what I would call a true pilgrimage, going to Mount Vernon, And oh yeah, seeing George Washington's teeth. But we see some regional museums as well as some national museums. And Stuart remembers going to Monticello, one of my favorites, obviously from my time there. So it's just really interesting to see. And so the big idea is that not everyone has that kind of personal connection to museums. What we find is that usually people who are going to museums today are ones that started out as a young person going to museums. And so what do we do if someone doesn't have that tradition of visiting historic sites or museums? If we do visit as a child, we're more likely to visit as an adult. And so how do we kind of change that trajectory? And this is, of course, assuming that when you go and visit a museum or historic site when you're a child, that you actually had a positive experience, that no one yelled at you, you didn't get stung by a bee, you didn't lose your lunch, or something, or there wasn't some kind of family drama in the big road trip. But hopefully if people have a positive experience as a child, they are more likely to visit a museum in the person. But what do we do if people haven't, like I said, haven't visited as a young person with their family? What can we do to help convey that it actually would be a nice time? You would be an enjoyable experience if you visited a house museum or a historic site. What can we do to make that message compelling to people who don't already know this? How can we talk it up to our neighbors? And I would argue the idea that we can make a visit to a house museum or historic site more compelling is to talk about more diverse stories. I think those will attract new and different audiences. We need to think about, make sure that people who come for the first time, that they will expect to feel comfortable, that they'll feel that they are included and wanted. And we have to make sure that it isn't going to be boring, that is actually worth their time. And it's important for them to kind of support and know more about their local cultural institutions. And I think the big thing that in general, history museums especially, and especially house museums need to do is really kind of change their core message, change it up from the way that we've been talking about history in the past. I think we need to do as a field, all house museums. I think house museums in general need to do a better idea of answering the question, so what? Oh, sorry. So what? So it's not, in my opinion, it is not good enough just to preserve a house because it's an important person lived there. We just can't, save it and then put out some furnishings for people to admire. Even though that is how the house museum field started. That's our roots of our interests here. But there is an inherent bias in the system that created house museums because it leads out a lot of the stories of other people. Traditionally, house museums are very good in answering a lot of factual questions. Questions like, how are all the family members who lived in this house related? What year was the house built? What did their dining table look like? But why shouldn't visitors care about those details? Where's the meaning that comes from answering those questions? For our visitors, what is their relevancy to their lives today? How does this go and get incorporated into their regular routines? So I propose, or I put forth, that if a museum can't answer the question, so what? Then visitors definitely won't be able to answer that either. And as a result, they won't care about what a museum is doing or what it's trying to say. So just for an example, here at the Lippitt House, this is what our kind of big idea is. It's not our mission statement, it is not our vision statement, but it's a principle that we try to really explore when we talk about developing new programs, when we do our docent training, to make sure that all has a point. We can answer the so what question. And so for Lippitt House, the idea is that through our interpretation and programs, we use the lives of the Lippitt family and the servants who lived and worked at 199 Hope Street to examine Providence's industrial and immigration history to provide perspective and insight in today's Providence. There's a reason why the Lippitt family built this big old fancy house on Providence East Side in 1863, because that story relates to larger threads about local history in Providence, national history, and international. And I just kind of pose as a challenge, as an exercise for you all. What is the big idea that you want your visitors to know or think about after coming on a tour or going to a program, whether it's in person or visual? Just kind of keep thinking about that. So one way that I think museums can answer the so what question is expanding the perspectives that are shared so that you can increase the possibility for connections with visitors. Just don't leave history in the 18th or 19th century. Specifically call out, what does the history about this site, this people, this house, tell us about our world today? Help visitors make those connections. It's easier to do if you bring more people into the conversation. Or as Eliza Hamilton says, let me be part of the narrative. This is a lyric from the hit Broadway musical Hamilton now on Disney+. And as a person who spent a lot of my career so far at Monticello, I'm always happy to put in a little pop culture reference to the founding fathers here. So house museums in general usually have a lot of documentation regarding usually the important, the powerful or the wealthy people that had the house built or lived in it. And those are relatively easy stories to kind of dig out and talk about. If you're talking about a museum, a house that is now a museum, it's usually because the person who owned the house made some kind of mark in the world, whether it's political or business or in the arts, a writer, an artist, something like that. But there are other stories connected to these houses, and sometimes it's harder to find out those details, but that doesn't make them less important. Questions you can answer or try to answer are, who were their servants that made the house run and took care of the needs of the family who lived there? Who were the craftspeople that built the house or maintained the house? Who were the laborers? Who were the guys that delivered the groceries, tended the garden, delivered the ice or the coal in the winter? And a great resource is census records. You can really pull out a lot of specifics about the people that maybe lived or worked in the house that weren't part of the primary family. So just for an example, I think we're going to talk, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we explore those kinds of threads for the Lippitt House specifically. So for the Lippitt House, we want to delve a little deeper into how the wealth was created that made the Lippitt House possible. And so we try to share the stories of both the direct and indirect labor that, that the family benefited from. Now, the Lippitts were a textile manufacturing family, and even though the focus of our interpretation starts when the house was built in 1865, we still discuss how the family benefited from enslaved labor. The Lippitt Manufacturing Company started in 1807 and started with weaving cotton cloth. The cotton was cultivated by enslaved laborers and was purchased for the mill from cotton brokers in Savannah, Georgia. And so even though the house wasn't literally built by enslaved people, nor did they work inside the house as servants, the Lippitt family still benefited from the slavery system. And so excluding that part of the Lippitt story perpetuates inequity and doesn't fully recognize the full story and the Lippitt family's privilege about how they were able to afford the fine things that they had in the Lippitt House that we are able to enjoy and study today. Another story, just using the Lippitt House as an example, as a story that we try to include in our interpretation is the story of the laborers in the Lippitt-owned mills. The Lippitts employed hundreds of workers in 6 textile mills in Connecticut and Rhode Island, and many of those laborers, including children. Many mill workers were European immigrants that came to places like Rhode Island and Massachusetts looking for economic opportunity and advancement by working in manufacturing. But not all careers and vocations were available to these laborers, these immigrants. Some had no choices but for their entire family to work in dangerous textile mills. So the idea is not just keep that as a very sad and dark spot in history, but that's in the past and we don't need to worry about it today. No, no, no. We can use that history, that labor history, to make connections to child labor and unsafe working conditions today. Is there something that we can do by engaging with visitors on this very tough part of history, the messy side of history, to make connections with our visitors today that might inspire them to take action or promote change in our labor forces today? The idea is to incorporate the stories of many individuals connected to one place and share as many specifics as possible. So these people, these folks, are seen as real people that we can all relate to. Just don't talk about a cook or a laundress who might have done work in the house. Use names to make it personal so it's easier to make these connections. And prioritize all the stories, even if they're hard or incomplete. For an example, this photo that I'm showing, we don't have any photos so far that we've been able to find of actual Lippitt laborers. There's one oral history account that I know of, but just because we can't name the individuals that worked in the Lippitt mills doesn't mean we can't talk to them, talk about them. So you kind of use contemporary examples, this one of a mill in Warren, Rhode Island. So just because we don't have all the answers doesn't mean that we can't talk about these stories. And the idea is that by incorporating these stories, you can identify larger threads that connect multiple people to the site, and you can take it from a specific example for this one house, this one family, and make connections much, much broadly. Another thing that we do at the Lippitt House is we just don't confine our interpretation in our programs just to the 19th century. Even though Henry Lippitt died in 1891, the stories that we tell and the themes that we explore continue past that. So one thing, so when you go on a tour to the Lippitt House, which I hope you all will, is we just don't talk about family genealogies. It's not a connoisseurship kind of tour where we talk about who made that chair or who painted that painting. But if someone asks the question, most of the time we can answer those questions for you. But what we do is we try to focus on ideas. And one of the big ideas we like to promote is the idea of promoting civic engagement. We take the inspiration from the Lippitt family, from their public service through elected office, their political advocacy done not only by the Lippitt men, but Lippitt women who up until, of course, 1920, could not vote or hold an elected office, as well as lots of volunteer leadership exhibited by the family over multiple generations. Today, we try to encourage people to get more involved in civic matters today. And so in that spirit, we have started a community discussion series in partnership with the League of Women Voters. The idea is we bring experts representing different backgrounds and expertise to put a Rhode Island and kind of local spin on big national topics and issues, to try to answer the question, how does this affect Rhode Islanders? Well, how do you take a national thing and bring it down to the neighborhood? So the idea is that with these community discussions, that with education, that it will help people feel better informed about the issues, and that they will feel equipped to take action and make change in their community. The idea is not just to think about the action, these issues, but actually do and take and make change in our communities. And so this year, we for our community discussion series, we are inspired by the suffragist legacy and the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which I know that Dawn has done some programs with this year as well. And so we're looking at the issues that the suffragists fought for and we are still working for today. So the idea is there are still threats to voting rights today. There are still issues about criminal justice reform and working towards true equity in the workplace. And so this was a program that was originally planned for March as an in-person program, but it's now an online program that we are, the first session is going to be next Wednesday. And so we are taking it virtually, and it's a great resource that we have working with a partnership with the Providence League of Women Voters. It expands capacity for both organizations. And I think that's important when you're talking about a museum. Doing a partnership, it needs to be a win-win for all the partners. And so the idea is that for Lippitt House Museum to partner with the League, we are able to build on the reputation of the League as a nonpartisan group and draw on their experience from moderating debates to expand the focus. The League of Women Voters in Providence is relatively small, and they don't have a facility. And so in the before times, before March, they had limited physical capacity to hold programs for people that weren't League members. And so by partnering with us, with our staff, we're able to better promote and help get the word out about the program. And I think we both feel that it's a better program by partnering between the League and Lippitt House. It's better than if we had tried to do it both separately. And so I pose for you, for supporters and volunteers of the RJD, what is your relevancy for New Bedford today? Can you connect the specific stories of your house, the three families, and all the residents that lived in that house with New Bedford today? Can you make connections with people maybe who didn't grow up in New Bedford, whether they're transplants or immigrants from other parts of the country or around the world? Why should people that maybe don't know the RJD, why should they care about the museum? I would encourage you to kind of expand the stories and perspectives that are shared during your tours and programs. There's, which was mentioned, and I know you do so already, but maybe think about more about what those contemporary stories might be that kind of draw on this wonderful tradition of the abolitionist movement in New Bedford. How can you integrate those stories and history into all the programs that you do to inspire new thinking today? Once again, to take that from people who are having knowledge to taking action to make all our communities better and stronger. Another example of a partnership that I'm very happy for at Lippitt House is a partnership to build constituencies outside our kind of normal house museum audience. This is a way that we, as being another small house museum, is to kind of expand our reach. And so we partner with a group called the Rhode Island Family Literacy Initiative, and it's a program for English language learners. And so together, we developed an outreach program. We work with the organization on a curriculum that meets their needs, and they are a group that was looking for ways for their students to kind of make more connections in their community. Some people have lived in Providence and Rhode Island for many, many years. Some have just been here for 4 weeks. And so we took this as an opportunity to make meaningful connections with a segment of Providence's community that might not otherwise, kind of choose on their own to visit a Victorian house museum on Providence East Side, by making this really meaningful program. And I think it's our duty to kind of reach out to these new audiences. Just don't depend on if we offer it, they will come. I think it has to be strategic, especially for small institutions, but it's the same for large places too. There's never enough time and money to do it all. So kind of target who you would like to incorporate with, and make meaningful connections with organizations that are already serving those communities. It's an opportunity that you can really amplify those organizations and work together, and once again reach a bigger, broader audience than you would be if you were separate. And so in general, I just encourage you to not be scared of sometimes these very difficult questions or topics related to economic inequity or social or racial injustices, but don't be scared to ask questions that don't know the answers to beforehand, and be bold. And like I said, I think this is a time where we can kind of regroup and really kind of figure about, we as a field, as an organization, as a sector of the arts and culture community, think about where we are, but more importantly, think about where we want to go and start taking those steps to get there. So thank you very much for letting me speak to you, and I hope that I can see you all at the Lippitt House sometime soon.
Thank you, Carrie. So I can hear all the clapping for you. The one thing I miss about Zooms is that there's no applause. You can't hear applause. So we were going to take questions, I believe, if you're okay with that, right, Carrie? And we actually have one. We welcome everyone in attendance to enter your questions in the Q&A box. If you do have trouble finding a Q&A box, go ahead and use the chat. I will look there as well. But our first question, I think he intended us to read this live, so I will read you. Stuart's question is, in addition to expanding the stories about the past, like servants or the Lippitt Mills, are there examples of or value in asking what happened to whale oil, textile manufacturing, child labor, kitchens, etc. in modern times?
Yeah, I would say definitely. And I think that's the thing, that you can use the historical past as a kind of jumping off point to get to the contemporary situations. And so when what we do at the Lippitt House is not, explain like where they get all their money, how did they build this big fancy house, and explain, that it was related to textiles. And so for Providence, the idea is, which I think is a similar but different story in New Bedford, we are surrounded in Providence by that legacy of that industrial past that is frankly no longer part of the story. And I think by talking about the historical precedents, you can get to where we are today and why things changed. There's a lot of stories in Providence. There's a lot of manufacturing, just like in New Bedford, and those things that are manufactured over time have kind of had, come and go, and then something replaces it, even if it's not manufacturing. And I think you can use that history to get to, why is New Bedford the way it is today? Why are things the way? I think as post-industrial cities, that explains a lot about frankly, the urban challenges both communities face, and explain that there were things here that were very, Providence in the late 19th century per capita was the richest city in America per capita in 1890. It's not that way anymore. And I think that context can help really kind of set the stage for your visitors to bring things up to today.
I don't see any new questions, so I'm going to ask one, which is just, I'm curious how long it took you. I assume you went through a kind of a reinterpretation process with your board and staff, or how did that work for you to come to this reinterpretation of the house with these stories that you have shared with us?
Yes, it wasn't a quick or easy process, and it shouldn't be. It was when I came to the museum, I was the museum's first director, and we had no interpretation plan. It was the way that a lot of house museums are, as you can kind of hopefully see over my shoulder. This is a still of the Lippitt library, which is very elaborately painted with hand grading and stenciling, and it's a very pretty house, and there's lots of pretty things in it. And the tour, that's what they talked about. But like I said, I thought, like, well, the house is pretty, but so what? Why should people care? And so I think the first step was really listening to community members, inviting office, not just talking to the people that already knew the museum and supported it and liked it, but try to talk to people about who don't know the museum, if they had an impression, if it was positive or negative, even talking to people that maybe were involved in other aspects of Providence civic life and other arts and cultural organizations, but maybe didn't know anything about the museum. So some of it was a self-analysis, what are our strengths, having a body of knowledge and try to figure out what the themes are that made sense. I mean, you need to think about the things that have the most relevancy to your site. And then what I would say is kind of have legs, like where can you go with that? We know that a lot of the Lippitt servants were immigrants, and a lot of the workers in the Lippitt-owned mills were immigrants as well. So what can we do to kind of talk about Providence as a city of immigrants? It was and remains today. And so I think it's a combination. It needs to take time. And I think the idea is that by including outside voices, not just leaders within your organization and members and donors and visitors as well. And then I think since you all have a very vibrant school program too, part of your constituency is your teachers and your other educators. So I think you need to kind of set a wide net. And then I think you can kind of see where things just might naturally kind of fall, and then be able to proceed about what makes sense for your site and what goes with your really great assets.
Thank you. We've got two questions. So Mark, who is a longtime supporter of the RJD, asks, he's curious, how do you measure the impact of, quote, so what? For example, in your mission, how do you measure the so what of providing perspective and insight into today's Providence? Great question, Mark.
It is, and that's something that grantors often ask questions to get measurable results, and you know that too, Don, being from an education background. Some of these things are difficult to measure. It's kind of over time. It might not be immediately relevant or apparent, I should say, after one visit. But the idea is that it's a cumulative project. I think the idea is you might see the results. It might have a long time horizon, and I think you have to go into it with that. But I think the idea is that you give people tools, and you can give them resources to kind of follow up after your experience. That's why websites are such a great thing right now. So it is hard to be able to measure, but you can do some evaluations. You can do evaluations before a program and after a program, and see if people have new information that they didn't have before, see if it changed their perspective, if they learned something new. And you can just ask people. Like I said, it won't happen to every visitor, but I think even when even if it is more abstract, I think you'll find that when there's the information that you discuss with your visitors, whether in programs or in tours, will have more resonance and will just stick once there's that greater context and there is a big idea, rather than it just being kind of random information without a purpose. If there's an organizing principle, it will inherently have more meaning and might stick with people, whether they take action now or down the road. It is a kind of a fuzzy thing to try to predict and measure.
Great. So I think it looks like we might have time for one more question, and there is one more question. I'm going to see if I might need to interpret this one. This is from Rick asking, he says that making the museum a platform event seems to me as much a part of the museum as its past. How does one bridge the divide in order to tell a more robust story of past, present, and future? And I think he might be suggesting, you know, how do you fold current events, and we do things like poetry readings in our Rose Garden, to that, you know, historic house or historic site. I hope I'm interpreting that correctly.
Well, you might see that maybe some of the programs you offer might not relate to some of these big interpretive ideas. And if they're well attended and people like them and they don't lose the organization money, there's a place for them too. There is a matrix that I think of things that things are kind of get gold stars if it's relates to your mission and people enjoy, and also hopefully either are sustaining or make you money. But if it doesn't, if people aren't coming and it doesn't relate to your mission and it costs the institution money or it doesn't make money, then maybe you can kind of cancel that. But I think there's a place for both. There's a place for programs that really are kind of what I would call like really heavy duty mission centric. And then there's a place for programs that are just fun, that build fellowship and community. I think they have a place. But I think the idea is that when you do think about your programs, just try to think about what are the big themes. And even if it's not specifically related, think if there is a thread that can bring it up to contemporary. So even, let me see if I can think of a good example. Well, here's the idea. You would keep it a program historical if you do a program on like an exhibit on the 19th Amendment. That would be a very traditional kind of historic program or exhibition that focuses on 1920. And you could do it very comprehensively, talk about the long fight leading up to the suffrage movement, the actual passage of the 19th Amendment. You can call out, you know, different, you know, rock stars and leaders in the field going back to the mid-19th century. But the idea is you can take that historical commemoration and bring it up to today to talk about voting rights and barriers to voting. It's not like the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920 and everything was hunky-dory. It's a long progress towards true universal adult suffrage, including like the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So if you didn't bring it up to the current, you could have had a very lovely exhibit about the 19th Amendment, but it wouldn't really kind of take that relevancy to today. And so by taking that as an inspiration, you can make it a program about that has more contemporary relevancy. And so example, for this election, which we never would have predicted when we designed the program last year that we thought we were going to do in March, issues about voting in a pandemic, issues related to mail-in ballots or early voting, issues related to re-enfranchising convicted felons. These are all issues related to voting rights. And so that's my example of, you could take a historical event or program and you could just keep it confined to that historical period, or you can see, even if we all know women have the right to vote now, it is not a controversial subject like it was in the 18th and early 19th centuries, but take that spirit and then bring it up to the contemporary relevancy related to voting rights for many disenfranchised individuals today.
Wonderful, thank you. I think then with that, I want to thank Carrie very much for being here on my screen and on all of your screens at home. This was a really wonderful way to conclude our business meeting of the corporation and the museum. And so we had a lot of board members tuned in, a lot of former board and donors and members. So I'm sure they found that fascinating. And I want everyone out there keeping your thinking caps on for the RJD, keeping in mind what Carrie has said in relation to the RJD, because we may just come and ask you your thoughts. In fact, I would love to have your thoughts in answer to that question, so what? So, so I hope to see you all again soon on a Zoom. Thank you again, Carrie Taylor, for being here. Please all go visit the Lippitt House. It's a very short drive and it is a lovely space. And you are open. It sounds like you're open for visitation, right, Carrie?
Yes, we are doing things a little differently, like lots of other people. We are doing private tours by appointment, and we're actually focusing on the exterior, on the architecture and the landscape, and then an opportunity to come in the house afterwards. But we still hit the same big ideas. We're just using different parts of the house to tell those stories.
Great. Well, I want to thank you again, and thanks everyone for coming. We will see you hopefully on a Zoom again, and here at the museum, because we are also open for visits by appointment. Thank you all, and good night.